Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for today's public forum, Closing the Loop for Lupus in Women's Healthcare. I am Irene Inye, Chief Science Officer of the Society for Women's Health Research. SWHR is the thought leader in promoting research in biological sex differences in disease and improving women's health through science, policy, and education. Earlier this month, SWHR's Lupus Working Group convened for a roundtable meeting to discuss scientific and policy issues related to the impact of lupus on women's health across the lifespan. Members of this interdisciplinary working group include experts in lupus and autoimmune disease research and clinical care, lupus patients and patient advocates, and healthcare policy leaders. Today's public forum will share insights and highlights from the discussions that took place during the closed meeting, building awareness around key research gaps and unmet needs in clinical care, education, and policy, with a goal of improving care for women living with lupus. We're pleased today to have three distinguished panelists from the working group joining us for this event. Dr. Irene Blanco, Professor of Medicine and Rheumatology at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Ayana Duki, stand-up comedian, writer, and host of Hydroxychloroquines, a podcast on living with lupus, and Dr. Matt Harmon, Vice President of Clinical Solutions at the Employers Health Coalition. I would also like to thank the sponsors of today's event, Eli Lilly and Company, and Aranea Pharmaceuticals. We will be live tweeting during this event as usual and invite you to use the hashtag SWHRTalksLupus on all social media. At this time, I would like to introduce SWHR's Chief Advocacy Officer, Lindsay Haran, who will be moderating today's forum.
Thank you, Irene, and good afternoon, everyone. So to get started today, lupus is a chronic autoimmune disease, meaning that the body's own immune system attacks its own tissues and organs. While lupus most commonly affects the skin, joints, and internal organs like the kidney, it can cause inflammation and pain in any part of the body. As you will learn in today's webinar, lupus does not affect everyone equally. Not only is the prevalence of lupus significantly higher in women, but the disease is also more prevalent among Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander populations. And there are differences among certain populations in disease severity and mortality. From the presentations today, you'll learn more about lupus, its effect on women's health, and how we as a society could better support those living with lupus. Following the speaker presentations, I'll be moderating a discussion with all of our panelists, so we invite you to use the Q&A box to submit questions throughout the event. We're going to start today with Dr. Irene Blanco, who will speak about lupus, how it's diagnosed, current and emerging treatment options, and how this autoimmune disease affects women differently from men. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Blanco. Over to you.
Thank you so much, the Society for Women's Health Research, for having me here today. And the topic for our discussion will be the diagnosis and treatment of lupus. These are my disclosures. So what is lupus? As you all heard, lupus is a chronic autoimmune disease affecting every organ system. And so when we say autoimmune, it means that the normal immune system that is supposed to attack infections that are trying to cause us harm actually start attacking our organs. So our skin, eyes, kidneys, etc. And that can lead to a lot of damage for patients. And really the dysfunction is at every single level of the immune system, which really makes it very challenging in order to find treatments for lupus patients. Now, how lupus comes about is likely a patient has, unfortunately, the right genetic background that when there's an environmental trigger like either another infection or, the sun, hence photosensitivity, that leads to the immune system activating and attacking the patients. So what happens? Patients start making antibodies against themselves, so autoantibodies. Those antibodies start fixing or sticking to something called complement. Complement's supposed to stick onto viruses and bacteria to signal to signal to the immune system that this is something that needs to be eaten up and cleared away. You can imagine if you start sticking complement onto a kidney or onto a lung, that the immune system now starts seeing that organ as something that it needs to attack and clear away. And all of those signals then start leading to chronic inflammation, which can cause permanent damage. And this slide is incredibly busy. And I actually took this slide from an incredible lupus physician, Lawrence Arnaud. He's in France. You could follow him at Lupus Reference. His graphics are phenomenal. And this is chaotic because this is what's happening in the immune system of lupus patients. Every single cell is turned on, and they're all talking with one another to amplify this massive immune response that's happening all over the body. And while there was recent reports that TLR7, this one little gene here, might be a silver bullet, if you will, for lupus patients and maybe a target for treatment, we know this already. This was already on the list. And while it may be a subset for certain children with lupus, really in adults with lupus, we've identified a whole host of genes that cause this inflammation within the patient. And they all interact individually and together to amplify that response. And because so many genes are involved in every single level of the immune system, we don't have that silver bullet, which is why we have these medicines that we use to kind of bring down the entire immune system, because we can't be incredibly targeted, because again, the problem is at every single level. Now, who gets lupus? It's overall a rare disease when we think about the general US population. There's somewhere between 500,000 to 1.5 million patients with lupus. It's predominantly a female disease where the ratio is about 9 to 12 women to 1 man in terms of who gets the disease, particularly in the childbearing years. During childhood, it's closer to 2 to 1. And around menopause, it's also closer to around 2 to 1. So there is something hormonal that happens, particularly with estrogen, that leads to that like amplification that we see in women with lupus. However, there is some data that when lupus happens in men, it's probably more severe. About 70% of patients with lupus are between the age of 15 and 45. And you could just imagine the ramifications then in terms of schooling, job productivity, career advancement, etc., when you have a chronic disease that can really cause you to be so ill. But that being said, upwards of 10% of patients do present over the age of 60, which could potentially be a problem, because if every doctor is taught that lupus affects this age bandwidth, they may not necessarily recognize it in either younger patients or older patients, because again, the disease can be so, and I love this term for it, kaleidoscopic, right? So a kaleidoscope, multiple different presentations and colors, right, of lupus. We may not, if you think lupus presents a certain way, you may not think of the even rarer ways that it can present. So overall, while it's definitely a disease more common in women, it's also a disease that's much more common in racial and ethnic minorities, particularly in the African diaspora, Asian populations, and Native American and Alaska Native patients. And while there is a genetic risk, as I showed you for lupus, it's not absolute. So when we say monozygotic twins, we mean identical twins. So the risk in identical twins, which have the same exact genetic code, so the same exact DNA, is about 25 to 50%. So it's not definite that like if one twin has lupus, the other one has lupus, but they definitely have an increased risk. But what we really see is that there's this spread of autoimmunity in a family, right? So a good percentage of lupus patients have a first degree relative, a cousin, a sibling, etc., with lupus. But what in essence you see is spread throughout the entire family. Somebody has lupus, somebody has autoimmune thyroiditis, somebody has rheumatoid arthritis, somebody else has Crohn's, somebody else has celiac. And so you see lots of autoimmunity within a family as opposed to like one disease over and over and over again. Now, all of you have heard of this, right? The ANA antibody, and checking our ANA test or having a positive ANA. That's a basic screening test that we use for lupus to help us get a sense of the autoimmunities. Because when we say anti-nuclear antibodies, it means your body is producing an antibody that's targeted to a certain part of your cells. But that's just an umbrella term. What we really want to know is the subserology. So all the little parts that fall into that umbrella. And some of you may have heard of terms like the anti-double-stranded DNA. Double-stranded DNA lives in the nucleus. So when we get antibodies against DNA, that's an anti-nuclear antibody because it lives in the nucleus. Smith lives in the nucleus. RNA lives in the nucleus. Row and log kind of comes back and forth within the nucleus. But some of these are really pertinent to disease manifestations. So for example, the double-stranded DNA tends to go up and down with disease activity, particularly the kidney. But Smith actually, while it's really specific for lupus, so if I see a Smith antibody, I know the patient almost definitely has lupus, but it doesn't tell me anything about disease activity. And some of these antibodies don't only affect the patient, but potentially might even affect their children, where, for example, the anti-Row and Law antibodies can cross the placenta and affect the fetal heart. And you may have heard of Sjogren's syndrome, which is dry eyes and dry mouth, and that's because these antibodies are helping to attack the glands that produce saliva and tears. Common lupus manifestations that we can see, right? The malar rash, the discoid rash, this is photosensitivity. So a red, angry rash when somebody goes out into the sun. Other manifestations, lip ulcers, the alopecia or the hair loss, the arthritis that can sometimes lead to joint deformities. But there's tons of organ inflammation that we don't see. And that's why if lupus is not on your radar, you may miss it. So Cyricitis, which is inflammation of the lining of the heart and of the lungs and of the stomach. Leukopenia, so low white count, low platelet counts, swollen glands, lymphadenopathy, fevers, right? You may think this is an infection. You go to the ER, they may think it's an infection too, when in reality, it's just a sign of this chronic inflammation. So it's imperative that we make sure that doctors, PAs, NPs, et cetera, know how to recognize lupus because it's relatively rare. If it's not on someone's radar, we can miss it. And childhood lupus actually presents a lot more acutely. So it's a more thunderclap kind of presentation as opposed to the adult presentation, which is kind of the smoldering presentation. But when kids present, they tend to present incredibly sick. So they'll have a lot of neurologic disease, and quite a few of them have severe lupus nephritis or lupus kidney involvement. Now, in terms of the meds that we use for lupus, you'll see that for mild, moderate, or severe lupus, we always use Plaquenil. And Plaquenil is actually working on that TLR7, on that most basic aspect of the immune system to kind of quiet things down. And while it's great for rashes and arthritis, it definitely doesn't tend to be enough when patients have much more severe. But we keep Plaquenil on, or hydroxychloroquine on, because we know that long-term lupus patients do better and have less flares and less organ damage when they keep on their hydroxychloroquine. Glucocorticoids or steroids, the med that we hate to love, right? We use them because they can shut down inflammation really quickly, which, time is organ, right, for us, but they have a lot of guaranteed side effects. So this is why, like weight gain, facial hair development, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, thinning of the bones, etc., which is why we want to move patients from the steroids to the medicines that might treat their lupus a lot better, where while there might be side effects with these meds, there are guaranteed effects of the glucocorticoids long-term. Things that we use for arthritis is methotrexate, We use mycophenolate and tacrolimus, voclosporin. These are the calcineurin inhibitors. That's what CNI means for lupus nephritis. But when we need something really, really impactful, when the patient is incredibly sick, they're in the ICU, we're looking for something like cyclophosphamide or rituximab. These are IV medicines to really bring down the massive inflammation that's happening in our patients. And while these are the medical treatments, we use them with adjuncts, right? So we need to think about sun protection, vaccines, critically important because your immune system is not working properly in lupus. And on top of it, we're giving you a medicine to bring it down even further, right? So we need to make sure that our patients are vaccinated against flu, COVID, Hep B, you name it, to make sure that we're protecting them because we're giving them medicines that will bring down their immune system. Lupus patients are at much higher risk of cardiovascular disease, so we recommend exercise, maintaining a good body weight, checking your blood pressure, your lipids, so your cholesterol, not smoking, because we want to really make sure that we protect your heart, your brain from having a heart attack or having a stroke. And for those patients that have antiphospholipid antibodies and are at risk for blood clots or issues during pregnancy, we also recommend potentially even low dose blood thinners or full on anticoagulation or full dose blood thinners. Now, you may have heard of a couple of new meds that have come on the scene for lupus. And one of the first one is Anaphylamide. This is an IV medicine. It targets this molecule called interferon, which helps amplify and turn on the immune system. This medicine hasn't proved to be the end all be all, but it actually works really, really nicely in skin. So for patients that have a lot of skin involvement, this could be a really great med to calm things down. And it does have some adverse reactions, and you particularly have to worry about chickenpox or shingles with anaphylamide. Now, Voclosporin, this has been touted as a great new medicine for lupus kidney disease, and I'm very excited to see where this is going to fit in with our current regimens. It works here on something called calcineurin, particularly on the big cell. This is the T cell that causes a lot of damage in lupus kidney disease. Right now, we have meds called Cyclosporine. This is hard to use. It has lots of side effects. And the one we use most commonly is here, Tacrolimus. So I use Tacrolimus a lot in our lupus kidney disease patients. The benefits of potentially Voclosporin is you don't have to check levels as much as Tacro, and potentially the patients may tolerate it a little bit better. That being said, there are some side effects like high blood pressure, potentially, ironically, some damage to the kidney that we do need to look out for. So this has to be monitored pretty closely as well. And again, we have so many medicines that we get so excited about and then they fail. And the reason being is that it's hard to put lupus patients into clinical trials. We don't typically tend to have very organ specific trials, i.e. only kidney, only brain, only skin, because there's not that many lupus patients. So many of them have what we call this heterogeneous or some not unified presentations of lupus, that then it makes it hard to understand the data we get back from the trials. Lupus nephritis and neuropsychiatric lupus, so lupus that affects the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves, are often excluded from the trials because those patients are so sick that they want them getting really standard of care instead of something new and experimental. Trials cost a lot of money and they may not run for long enough to really understand how well they work. And really, we don't really know what's an endpoint for lupus because this isn't a curable disease, right? So, we want our patients to get into remission. But sometimes it's hard to define what remission is going to look like, especially in somebody that has some degree of permanent damage. So for somebody that's had pretty bad kidney disease, that's always with a little bit of protein in their urine, what level would I determine remission? And these are the discussions that we're having here with the SWHR and amongst ourselves in rheumatology to really kind of understand how do we build good trials to get the meds that lupus patients need. But on top of this, we have to work with our patients in order to determine self-efficacy, right? What are the things that the patients need in order to manage their symptoms, their treatment, and the sequela of having a chronic illness, right? How do we help them manage everything at home and everything with their disease to help them take care of their lupus? And so we've also been working with organizations like the Lupus Initiative to put together resources for patients in order to create really cultivated content for patients that we know provides a lot of the really great resources they need to feel supported at this time. And so with that, I'll end, and thank you so much again for having me.
I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ayana Dukey to share her own journey with lupus and how it is tied into her passion for advocacy and work in this space. Thank you so much.
All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I was diagnosed with lupus on November 9th, 2012, and I remember that day exactly. It was 3 days after my 31st birthday. Leading up to my diagnoses, for the 2 years prior to, I thought I had carpal tunnel. I was later diagnosed with tendinitis, and now I have learned that it was neither of the two. It was actually lupus. What led me to my diagnoses was one morning I woke up and my hands were literally stuck like this, like crabs, to the point where I couldn't even open my bedroom door. I had to do one of these moves. I went into the shower, took a hot shower, they relaxed, I moved on with my life. At that point, I was 30 years old. I did not have any types of issues going on in my body that I knew of. Chronic illness, lupus, those things were far from anything I thought what was happening in my body. The next morning, the same thing happened. Woke up, crab hands again, had to open the door, went in the shower, they relaxed, but the fact that it happened 2 days in a row gave me pause, and I called my dad, who suffers from gout, and I was hoping it was not gout because I've seen what gout can do. And he assured me it was not gout. I'm not sure how he knew, but he told me this is not gout. And he then told me I need to go to the doctor. So I went to the doctor. Apparently I was running a fever, did not know that. And he ordered blood work. A few days later, he came back and told me that more blood work needed to be taken. And at that point, my sister, who was in nursing school, looked at my labs and said, this looks like an autoimmune condition. First time I'd ever heard the term autoimmune, and first time I ever heard that I might have a condition. Shortly after that, I was diagnosed with lupus and sent to a rheumatologist. That process was very quick for me. Like I said, it was about 2 years of me having symptoms that I thought were tendinitis and carpal tunnel before I was officially diagnosed. And I consider myself lucky because I believe it takes on average 6 years for people to have an official lupus diagnosis. Since then, I've had multiple flares. I've ended up in the hospital, in the ER. I have lived as a stand-up comedian in New York, suffering with lupus, not having health insurance. And I tell everybody that having a chronic illness, being sick in this country without health insurance is extremely dangerous, because lupus is not something that people are very aware of. And I think because of that, there's a lack of understanding and empathy when you're faced with this. So leading up to where I am now, like she mentioned in my intro, I have a podcast called Hydroxychloroquines that I host with another lupus warrior, who is a poet, singer, and educator. And essentially the purpose of our podcast was to, for lack of better words, normalize living with lupus. A lot of the information that I've seen surrounding lupus are always essentially how-tos, what to eat, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And a lot of the information is extremely conflicting. For example, I just attended a gut health seminar sponsored by the Lupus Foundation of America. And the questions that I saw from fellow lupus warriors involved, what's a lupus diet? What's the proper way to eat? And there hasn't been no one has figured out the proper way to eat with lupus other than eat healthy. So in my podcast, we just try to talk about living with lupus, everything from dating to exercising, to having a normal job, to dealing with the challenges of having a job, to following your dreams, to does smoking weed or CBT or edibles, does that help? I mean, literally we cover the gamut in a very casual way. And the reason why we do that, again, it's just having a chronic illness, especially lupus, since it's an invisible disease, it's not talked about in a way that I feel is palatable for anybody who's been diagnosed or who's had the disease for, a very long time. So that's where my advocacy is. I also, as a comic, I tried to throw some funny in there and just help people know that they're not alone. That was how I felt when I was diagnosed. I was by myself. Literally the only two people that I knew, and I say no in quotation marks, that had lupus at that time was the singer Toni Braxton and Seal. And they have something I don't have, which is a lot of money. So how they managed their lupus, I knew it was going to be different than how I was able to manage mine. So again, I'm very happy to be a part of the working group. If you have any questions at the end, I would be more than happy to give you my experience as somebody living with lupus. And I would like to say thriving with lupus as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ayana. You have such an empowering story and an important call to action. And I love that you took your diagnosis and you created this podcast that, as you say, normalizes living with lupus. So thank you for all that you do. As a reminder for those who are tuned in live, you can submit questions for the webinar and our panelists at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to address as many as we can during the discussion part of the event. Next, we'd like to turn it over to Dr. Matt Harmon to discuss how we can improve workplace environments for individuals living with lupus and other chronic conditions that can affect day-to-day activities. So Dr. Harmon, over to you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ayana, for sharing your story. Those patient testimonials are super important in increasing awareness and moving initiatives forward. So definitely appreciate you taking the time to share what you've gone through and thriving, as you said. So nothing like following a stand-up comedian. So we'll get right to it. Here, got my slides going here. Hopefully you all can see them. So we'll get through over the next 10 minutes or so. We'll go through some of the lupus employee survey findings. We'll discuss some employer education, as well as some workplace situation kind of case scenarios that I think will be beneficial. And we'll, hopefully, if you have any questions, can go into some more of the data. As I was preparing for this presentation, always find more things I wish I included in here. So found some interesting employer survey, not just employee stuff, that we're happy to talk through as well. So with that, from the survey results, this first one we'll go through is the Lupus European Online Survey that surveyed about 2,070 lupus patients. And they found that about 7 out of 10 patients felt that lupus impacted their careers. And then about 60% had to reduce more than half of their working hours, and roughly 1 in 2 were still currently employed. And then the other 3 factors there, about 1 out of every 4 patients or so had to either have some sort of career change or after the first year of diagnosis, or apply to some sort of either Social Security disability benefits or long-term disability application. From an American survey perspective, there's a lot of lost hours that has cost the those workers in the economy about $13 billion annually. This is not just due to direct loss in wages, but also expenses for things like taking care of the household chores or things that patients that in more advanced stages of lupus may not be able to do. So there's a lot of economic burden, as many of you all might be aware of with this condition. Since not everybody has sealed money to help control their condition. But finally, there's another survey for employees at the annual meeting of the European League Against Rheumatism. About 40% of patients had to change their jobs. And then 1 out of every 4 patients felt like they're taking jobs below their qualification levels. And then almost half had some sort of lower income due to their condition. So I bring all these stats up to think, I feel like we can reduce these numbers, since if the employers are properly educated about lupus, the condition and the ability to make accommodations at the workplace. Kind of mention that I found there's some good employer survey data out on the job accommodation network that found that about half of employers that the accommodations had no cost at all or very little cost. It might be a one-time cost, and the average of that was about $500. And then a lot, employers definitely want to make the investment in their employees. It's much cheaper to make these investments in accommodations than getting rid of an employee and having to train a new person. And there's a lot of direct benefits by doing that, just from increasing productivity, but also indirect. Survey results show that company morale increased by improving workplace accommodations. And I think because maybe you have employees that if an employee that is impacted by lupus weren't meeting certain requirements of the job because they needed some sort of accommodation, once that those employees that were working with that person felt like things weren't working as planned, but then after that accommodation was made, they realized that that the job was getting done better, and they were able to work better as a team. So a lot could be done. We'll talk a little bit about that in the latter part of the presentation. From an employer education standpoint, just to highlight the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's passed in 1990. It's against the law for an employer to discriminate against someone that is qualified with a disability, and lupus does qualify as a chronic illness. There's some, the provisions. It's not explicit that you have to have lupus. It's based more about the symptoms of the condition, but does require the employer to make reasonable accommodations to enable the employee to perform their job. And now reasonable is kind of where sometimes the disagreements may occur between the employee and the employer. And but I think it's a very broad definition of what is reasonable. So we try to tell our employers just err on the side of caution. And as I mentioned, the costs associated with accommodations are relatively inexpensive. So it's very beneficial in the long run. I think the key piece, that third bullet point, is that it only applies if the employer has been made aware of the employee's disability. So I understand there's a major concern, from an employee perspective, informing their supervisor and manager about their condition, afraid of being, ostracized or, some sort of stigma associated around the condition. Don't want to be treated, as somebody that's less than, and which would be, very unfortunate. But it is important to highlight to your manager and have those conversations if possible. You can say, do you want to tell your fellow coworkers, or is this more of a confidential thing that you just want them, to be aware of from a supervisor perspective? So definitely important to consider. I don't know. Is there any question there? And then, if you want to determine, how this might apply, there's the link there. Also included all the links for sources. A lot of good information on the internet to help employers. So some basics. I know Irene's going to get more in depth into so I won't spend too much time here, but we know it's unpredictable condition. It impacts patients differently across the board in terms of severity and symptoms. But often it's an invisible condition, and try to encourage employers and the coworkers to listen to the patients and not be suspicious that they're just trying to use this condition as a way to get off work or have some sort of accommodation. So, since some of the symptoms, the most common one is fatigue. And, if it's a position that requires a lot of standing, is that person, could they benefit from a stool to sit down on, or some sort of chair, or have floor paddings that would help eliminate some of the fatigue as well as the pain associated with that. Another common symptom, the cognitive impairments, aka the brain fog. One potential tip would be, instead of giving just verbal instructions, providing written instructions and other memory type aids, listing and that sort of thing. We know about the photosensitivity to lupus. I'm sure Dr. Blanca is going to go more in depth in there. And some of the case studies a little later highlight some of the other potential symptoms and modifications that employers can make. As mentioned, the degree does vary. Some patients, as the survey showed, may, be able to work without any problems at all. But some employees will need some sort of accommodation. But many are, kind of maybe reluctant to change and don't want to make any accommodations, don't want to kind of be signaled out by their fellow coworkers. So they might be unlikely to bring it up until their work capacity is severely impacted. But really, we know that early intervention is really essential to increase the productivity and just overall job satisfaction, both by the employee and the employer. We don't want the employer to think that they have a poor performing employee and not understanding why that might be the case. And finally, there's really a low rate of allowed claims and benefits from Social Security disability programs. And if especially for a patient, if you're applied for them, you're generally denied that first time, and really need to keep applying to get get approval if that is if work is something that's unable to happen. But really, from an employer perspective, try to make any effort you can to help that patient maintain employment. So here's some questions to consider. What limitations is the employee experiencing? How can the job task be modified? I really like that second to last bullet point. It's like, yes, okay, we've made an accommodation. Let's evaluate its effectiveness and not just think, oh, yeah, we did something for this person. The box is checked. There should be good. We really need to evaluate, is this working appropriately? Are there other modifications that need to be done to improve the overall work environment? So in terms of job accommodations, some employers may have occupational therapists or vocational rehab counselors available. Others may need the patient from their own care team from an occupational therapist, and you can request that. And they will visit the workplace to assess, the job and the physical environment. The vocational rehabilitation counselor is great in working with the employee to deal with any types of issues that may arise, especially early on in diagnosis. Is that a lot of stress, obviously, that is involved with receiving a long-term diagnosis without a cure currently. So, and as the medications, we know these medications take a while to really help control the condition if they are going to at all. So it's a really important time in that early stage. So in terms of different accommodations, that last link in the source section, the Job Accommodation Network, has fantastic resources. Can't stress that enough. They break it down by work-related function. So you can look at, the light, and, or things like parking, as well as by the limitation, and things like balancing or pain. And there's a whole list. Dozens and dozens of things that can be done overall to provide the best environment possible for an employee. So let's walk through some different case studies to wrap things up. So we have 3 here. There's a claims representative with lupus has a sensitivity to fluorescent light, and also the radiation emitted from their computer monitor. We have an executive secretary with severe back pain due to arthritis, and finally, a systems analyst with lupus that has migraine headaches. So for the claims rep, what was done was they changed the overhead lights to broad spectrum by using a special filter that fit onto the existing light fixture. Didn't have to replace that light fixture. And then we're given a glare guard and flicker-free monitor. So, probably a few $100s there to benefit this patient and have them hopefully have a better job experience. And finally, with the executive secretary with back pain, we have those adjustable height and workplace stations, to again adjust sitting and standing, as well as adjustable keyboards, mouse trays, and a more ergonomical chair, which I think we should all have. But this is a great way for this employee to hopefully feel more comfortable in their setting. And then finally, with the system analyst, they kind of moved away from the cubicle and reduced some of the noise and distractions, which were triggers for their migraines, as well as adjusted some of the lighting, since we know fluorescent lighting can be a big trigger for migraine headaches as well. So there are a dozen different case examples on this website listed here. So just want to run through some different things. I just, it's important to understand, if you're an employee and are concerned about having those conversations. I think you'd be surprised at how willing employers are to do what they can to help keep you on as a member of their team. Hopefully they are. If not, it might not be the best place from a work environment anyways, but there are a lot of, from our employers that we work with at the coalition, and as well as some of the data out there, I think there's a big willingness. So I understand that it may be the concern to discuss with the employer, but hopefully some things you learn here that are ways to still, provide a good workplace setting. So with that, I will turn it back over to Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harmon. I think you've raised a lot of important considerations, but both for employees and also employers to improve the experience of those living with lupus in the workplace. You can go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Harmon and Ayana Dukey for the Q&A portion of today's event. So if everyone could turn on their cameras. Okay, I see you're both back. So again, if you have a question for any of our panelists, you can use the Q&A function of Zoom, or feel free to drop it into the chat box. And maybe I'll start, Dr. Harmon, since we just kind of ended with you. I think kind of toward the end, you were talking about some small adjustments that might be able to be done in the workplace. So if there are no formal accommodations set by HR, what can you recommend for a supervisor or a colleague to do in the interim? I know you mentioned the chair and the lighting, but is there anything else that kind of comes to mind for you?
Yeah, you're trying to have some scheduled, rest periods, since we know fatigue and pain are major, potential symptoms. That's if you're in kind of an office setting. If you're outdoor, maybe trying to take on tasks that are less physically demanding. So I think trying to avoid the sun at midday. There's a lot of different things that can be done. It's if there's not a set policy, it's really just having that conversation with the supervisor, being open and honest, and and kind of get them understanding about the condition. And since we talked about, there's a lot of variations and with symptoms, and I think once you're being open, hopefully that you're working with somebody that's empathetic and can understand what you're going through and be willing to work with you. I know there are a lot of employers out there that are willing to do that, and so trying to think about what are your potential symptoms. I would recommend, like I said, going to that job accommodation network and looking through some of the different things. There's a ton of different suggestions, from even if you're in more manual labor type settings, or there's a variety of different things. So looking through that and maybe providing your supervisor, here's an example. So because supervisors are likely going to be overwhelmed because they're not aware. So just, I think, coming with a list of potential suggestions. Everybody likes, if you're bringing a problem, you're also bringing a potential solution. So I think by doing that, that would go a long way.
Thank you so much. And I think that's actually probably a great segue. So kind of from the patient perspective, we know that managing a complex disease can often be challenging in terms of feeling educated and informed about different treatment options and long-term care. So what recommendations do you have for a patient with an autoimmune or immune-mediated skin condition to kind of get these resources and information and really feel empowered about taking the next steps in care. Ayana, maybe we'll have you answer that one.
I agree with what Matt was saying regarding if you're going to come, if you're bringing that to your employer's attention, to have some suggestions, because if they're unaware of what lupus is, you're put in the, I don't want to use the word burden, but essentially the burden of them researching what it is. And as most of us know, lupus impacts all of us in very different ways. For example, I was just talking to my co-host about the son. She got back from Turkey, and she said she went into a flare while she was on the trip because she was out in the sun a lot. Whereas for me, the sun doesn't affect me much. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm the most religious person with sunscreen, even though I know I should be, but for me, that usually is not a big problem. But I do suffer from fatigue. I don't get brain fog that much. So just being very specific about what your challenges are and what it is that you need. Also not being afraid to speak up for yourself. And I know that's easier said than done. That's not a problem I ever have. But I know others, they struggle with that, or the embarrassment of having to ask for help. That's something that for some of us, it's harder. But really, I'm not sure how to work through that. Maybe if you see a therapist on a regular basis, which is something I also recommend if you're battling a chronic illness, having somebody to help deal with your mental health, because it's not just physically taxing on your body, it's very emotionally draining on you as well, as you have to deal with these issues that like workplace accommodations. So speaking up for yourself, knowing that people are not going to necessarily know what lupus is. And again, as Matt, to piggyback again on that, making sure that you come with solutions and are very clear on what it is that you need, so that you're going to be comfortable and you can be your best self when you're at your place of employment.
I think that's such great advice, coming armed with solutions that could help improve your experience. I think is a really great point. Question for both of you. So it's kind of come up during the conversation that lupus disproportionately impacts women. And so in addition to the potential physical differences in lupus symptoms, women also potentially face more stigma than men when it comes to their appearance, whether it's hair loss or skin discoloration. In each of your experiences, how has this been addressed, whether it's in the policy, advocacy, or support spaces?
Matt, you want to go first?
Well, addressed here at our own company, just try to, provide, awareness that there is, differences out there. I think, a part of different, organizations, trying to create, policies. And I think right now it's the awareness, I think, has improved a lot since I started here, 9-10 years ago, at least, right now, having conversations. I think, a lot of the work that SWHR does helps with that. And so, I think we're, at least trying to get past the awareness stage now. Or what are some of the actions that we can do? And, I think it's not appropriate to make, comments on people's appearance. It never was, but, I think that now there's more of a, understanding that that's not appropriate now. It's that's a tough question to, from a policy standpoint, how do we address that? I think, we're trying to, move towards, all-inclusive, culture. At least that's how we have, all-inclusive culture. It's just, making that more widespread, and, looking for, if you're looking for an employer, looking for things that are, a great place to work, certify, these type of things where employees have to fill out surveys, and, looking at, makeup of different companies. And so, I think, and then that's something that employers should strive to be a part of these, recognized organizations. And if you're looking for a company, that's a good place to looking at those lists is a good way to know if it's be a good fit for you. I don't know if that answered it right. That's a tough one.
I have two examples on dealing with appearance and I guess what happens when you have lupus and your appearance. So prior to being diagnosed, I was, when I lived in Maryland, one of my colleagues who I considered a friend, me and her were very comfortable together. She gained a lot of weight, and that was all I saw. And at that point, I was a Weight Watchers leader. I was a vegan. I was a very annoying vegan. I would tell you that, you're gonna die if you ate cheese, like that kind of annoying. Not a fun person to be around. But she gained a lot of weight, and I don't feel good about saying this, but I said something to her about it. And to some extent, women were hard on each other when it comes to weight and things of that nature. And I was also younger, so please don't judge me. That's not who I am at the moment. And she told me that she had an autoimmune condition and she was on steroids, and it caused her to gain weight. And again, ignorance, I had no clue what was going on. That was probably the first time I ever heard the term autoimmune condition, outside of later on me being diagnosed with it. And I just remember her face, as I know now, it's the prednisone, the moon face that we get. And I remember that. It just stood out in my head because I didn't realize that a few years later, she would be the one I was calling, asking for information and help when I was diagnosed with lupus. And, it was a very humbling experience because later on I got to experience the weight gain of prednisone and the moon face and everything I had asked her about that happened to her. So like I said, I was on the giving and the receiving end of that situation. And it didn't feel good on either end. I also mentioned that I worked for Weight Watchers at one point, and after being diagnosed, I had a Weight Watcher member who came to me after a meeting asking for help because she was having a hard time losing weight because she had lupus. And I shared with her I also had lupus, and her response was, well, you must not have the same lupus as I do because I don't look like you. So I think and I understand that came from a place of pain and frustration. Anybody who's ever tried to lose weight, you understand, or tried to do anything that's hard, you understand how frustrating it can be when you feel like you're giving your best effort and you're not seeing any results. So I think there's, having a chronic illness, there are things that happen to your body. Some of it is caused by the medication. Some of it is caused not directly because of the medication, but just you're not able to exercise as much. Your skin might be affected by the lupus. You might just be tired and just look tired. There's so many things that can alter your appearance. Your joints hurt, your fingers are swollen, your feet are swollen, you're dealing with Raynaud's. I mean, your hair falls out. You might have a touch of surgeons. Exact quote from my rheumatologist when I complained about just nosebleeds and sores in my mouth and things like that. So there are a list of things. I guess it comes down to, again, education and awareness and, trying to get the word out on, lupus looks different. And sometimes it's not the lupus, it's the effects of the drugs that are happening to your body. So sensitivity, as Matt said, it's never appropriate to comment on anybody's body. And again, I apologize to my friend many years ago when I did that. I still feel poorly about, feeling that comfortable to say something to somebody about that. But again, it's like the universe came around and taught me a valuable lesson. And I hope that other people, especially as the society becomes more aware about just differences overall, that we all, know better, so we do better. I hope I answered your question, Lindsay. That was a hard one. I agree with Matt.
You did. And Ayana, I have to thank you for being so vulnerable with that response and really and sharing that story. I think it's an important reminder for us all that there's so much more than meets the eye. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. And kind of picking up on that, I know you have a podcast, but what advice do you have to help somebody explain or educate others about the impact of what is an invisible condition kind of in their day-to-day informal conversations? Is there any advice you have to help people navigate those?
Oof. First, know your audience. Who are you talking to and what is it? Again, I think Matt gave such great advice when he said as far as presenting a problem and also presenting a solution with it. So I'm going to keep piggybacking on his advice on that one. Who you're talking to. So are you dealing with somebody at work? Are you dealing with a potential significant other? Are you talking to your friends? For me, working a lot of the comedy clubs, most of the bookers, they know that I have a chronic illness. I'm very, well, obviously I have a podcast and they follow me on social media. So everybody's aware of that. So if I call, a few hours before a show and I say, I can't make it tonight, they give me grace because they know that it's not that I'm being unprofessional or unreliable. It's literally I have this condition. I did that yesterday. Yesterday I woke up and I guess I didn't sleep well. My body was just, everything was a challenge to do, just everything. I was so tired. And I had 2 shows last night and I messaged both bookers and I was like, it ain't happening. So the show must go on without me, but I won't be there. And everybody was completely understanding. Nobody, I hope they weren't talking behind my back, who knows, but I'm also one of these type of people who I don't care. But for the most part, people are very, very, very understanding. So know your audience, know what you're asking them. My husband, August will make 2 years and he's still learning. And especially with us dealing with the pandemic, when that first kicked off, I was like, well, I guess these are my final days, the way the CDC and the media made it sound. I'm not going to make it till 2023, but here we are. And especially my husband's a cop, so he was out and about, and I knew at some point I was going to get COVID, just the nature of his work. So, there were things that I asked him to do, don't come in the house with your clothes on. Like he had to be I had to make sure that he understood how serious it was, because neither of us had ever been in a pandemic before, and he's new to having a wife with lupus. And at times that was hard because I think he would think I was overreacting, and maybe I was, maybe I wasn't, I don't know. Again, we've never lived through a pandemic. So knowing my audience, knowing what I needed to ask of him, and just giving him grace as well, because he's learning in the process of having a wife with a chronic illness, on top of being newlyweds. So yeah, know your audience and present solutions to the problems that you're bringing up, again, to piggyback on what Matt said.
Thank you so much. And Matt, another question for you related to the workplace. So women may experience absenteeism at work or school due to their medical condition. So what can we do from kind of a policy perspective to support women who are experiencing this kind of indirect burden from disease?
Well, yeah, one, having, if you're in a flexible type working environment, so, that not every job has that ability, but you're looking out for jobs that have where you can take a few minutes here we can operate here. As long as you get your stuff done, it's okay. You come in at 10 o'clock if that's what you need to because you have some appointment. We actually had a commenter that's one of our fellow members of the working group mentioned FMLA. So once that's approved, an employee can use that for any kind of appointments when they don't feel well. I think that's was a good recommendation from Juana. So from policy, you have try to look for types of any kind of flexible arrangements that you might not have that currently in your position, but having those conversations with your supervisor could lead to that. It's like I can get the job done. Yeah, I might need to take an hour here or 2 hours here or this day, but if it's something you can do some things remotely, like yeah, I know we're typically a Monday through Friday, but I really need I need to be off this Thursday. So I'll do some stuff on Saturday or Sunday to make up for it. Like you said, kind of offering a way to make up for potential missed work. And, while it may not feel like you need to be accommodating to your employer, I think having that kind of mindset and communication, I think that your employer might say, oh, no, that's not even necessary. We'll be fine if you just take the day. You don't even have to work on the weekend to make it up. But at least offering it, I think, will go a long way from a retention standpoint. So, and then, if we can create more kind of how-to guides from a policy perspective, and that's for employers to think about, accommodations and flexible scheduling, that might be a benefit from the working group down the road as we collaborate on materials for both patients and providers and employers as well. So I think there's some good resources that we can collaborate on.
Great, thank you so much. And Ayana, we had a question come through for you, kind of about lifestyle factors and whether or not you felt like your diet made a difference in the management of your lupus.
Yes, but not in the way that I feel like a lot of influencers, that's what I'm going to call them. So like I said, when I was diagnosed, I was vegan. I had lost 65 pounds with Weight Watchers. I was a Weight Watchers leader. I haven't been successful in the program. I had done P90X, Asylum, ran Tough Mudder, super active. Just listing that makes me tired now. And I was, be very open, I was pissed off when I was diagnosed. I took such incredible care of myself, and I ended up with an incurable disease. So now I do have a dietitian. I've been seeing her for a few months, and she has me on an anti-inflammatory diet. Prior to that, I've tried green smoothie cleanses. I did a 10-day green smoothie cleanse. I'm surprised my husband is still married to me after that, because it was not fun. It was not fun at all. And I've just tried different things, again, things that I've found on the internet, because there are a lot of books and products and people that promise you that they can literally cure your lupus. And I am probably, like a lot of lupus warriors, desperate. Somebody presents you with something that, if you only eat, pulverized spinach all day, you can live a normal life, which is not the case. So I think as far as diet goes, yes, eating healthy is important. But then again, that word healthy, what does that really mean? I think healthy means different things to different people. I've done keto. I did keto for 4 months. That was specifically to lose weight. I lost a ton of weight. It came off very quickly. I did that with intermittent and extended fasting. So there were times where I was fasting 36 hours. It was hard to maintain, but that was probably physically the best I'd ever felt. The problem with that is I couldn't maintain it. So it's like, yeah, I feel great, but I can't live like this for the rest of my life. So to me, I consider that a fail, because what's the point of doing all of this work when I'm unable to maintain that? So right now with my dietitian, I'm what's considered a pescatarian. So that means I eat fish. I eat eggs as well. I don't really eat dairy. I don't eat meat, not because of the lupus. I don't eat meat because I've never liked meat. I'm one of those weird people that is literally repulsed by the thought of meat. So I'm not saying I'm a pescatarian because that's what I think works, but that's just my preference. So I say all that to say, experiment with your body, because the same way lupus impacts us in different ways, and the sun doesn't bother me, but I get tired and I don't get brain fogs, but my joints ache. That's the same thing with diet. So what's going to work for you? What makes you feel the best? Sugar is not my friend. I still eat cupcakes and try my luck, and it never works out. Alcohol is not my friend. Literally, it's a 48-hour turnaround. I've tried edibles because everybody seems to think that weed is a cure for everything. I am a comic, so I'm around a lot of that. Does not work for me. Again, it takes 48 hours for my body to get back to feeling any kind of normalcy. So you have to figure out what works for you. And literally, we're like ongoing science fair projects, having a hypothesis, test it out, see what happens. If it doesn't work, then try again. But overall, we know that, what's healthy, eat lots of vegetables. But yeah, so I think I answered that.
Did. Thank you so much. And thank you for the nuance of your response. I appreciate that. And I'm sure our viewers do as well. So I recognize that we're kind of coming up to the top of the hour. So before we wrap up, I want to ask one last question. So we often have patients and healthcare providers, as well as researchers and policy professionals, tune in to webinars like this one. So what is one takeaway each of you would recommend to viewers to help them support or improve care for women, patients, and caregivers who are living with lupus? And maybe we'll do it in the order of your presentation. So maybe we'll start with Ayana and end with Matt.
One bit of advice. I will say, learn how to speak up for yourself. I'm speaking from the point of somebody with lupus. Learn how to speak up for yourself. Going back to, again, I feel like I keep on piggybacking on that one thing Matt said about presenting a problem and coming up with a solution. So when I say speak up for yourself, I mean to your doctors, to your, even if you have to call your insurance, to your spouse, to your friends, to your employers, whoever it is, whoever's a part of your life, speak up. And to piggyback also on what Stella is saying, as far as take care of yourself. You see your doctor once every, 3 to 4 months for 20 minutes. Don't expect that that's enough. Your health is your priority. You can't blame anybody else. It's tempting to do that when you've been blessed with an autoimmune condition, but you can't blame anybody else for what's going on. It is your sole responsibility to take care of yourself, and it's literally life or death. So speak up, whatever you need. Don't be afraid to ask, even if you feel like it's selfish or you're being annoying. You need to get what you need to get, and always ask for help. It's hard at times, especially if you're someone who's been diagnosed with lupus later on in your life, such as myself. Up until then, I was able to do things on my own. Now I've gotten very accustomed and comfortable going out to my doorman if my husband's not home to ask him to open a bottle for me because my hands aren't working. So ask for help, and no matter how small or big the request might be. Matt.
Yeah, that's good. I guess from a policy perspective, I guess talking about the workplace accommodations, a lot of those, dealing with symptoms that apply to other conditions. So we can create policies that make it more beneficial or more widespread to do these type of accommodations for everybody that's experiencing some sort of fatigue or pain, and maybe having training, mandatory training for anybody that manages people or supervises individuals to understand burden of illness and ways to accommodate those employees to be functional or not functional, that's not the right word, but have a more enjoyable work environment. Because if they do, then they'll want to come to work. They'll want to be, involved with the organization. So I don't understand, why we wouldn't want to strive to that. So I think we can, have some sort of charge to policy makers to have more flexible scheduling and, increase supervisor training around the burden of illness and ways to accommodate workers to benefit employers overall, since the survey results show with employers that when they do these changes, they see the benefit. There's not a large cost, and it improves morale and overall productivity. And so we just, I think, need to create that awareness, and by doing that, some sort of mandatory training, or creating resources for cheaper training if you're bringing in people on site, that sort of thing would go a long way.
Thank you so much. Such an important conversation all the way around. And I hope that conversations like these are really what's going to drive change at the end of the day, raising awareness, improving education, and really making a difference for those who are living with autoimmune diseases and conditions. I would like to thank our amazing panel for their time and insight. And of course, thank you to Eli Lilly and Company and Aurinia Pharmaceuticals for their support of this public forum and SWHR's lupus program. We'll be sending out an email with the recording of today's webinar to all registrants, as well as post the recording on the event's webpage for future viewing. So please be on the lookout for that and feel free to share with others. For more information about lupus and other women's health topics and resources and events, or to sign up for SWHR's newsletter, we ask that you visit our website at www.swhr.org. We also invite you to connect with us on social media, including on our new Instagram account, handle SWHR_official, as we continue the conversation with SWHR Talks Lupus. Thank you so much for joining us.